Alrighty, folks, welcome back to Technical Knockout, the MMA podcast. Today we're going to be doing a historical piece. We are going to be talking about my personal favorite fighter of all time, Frankie "The Answer" Edgar. We're going to do a little career retrospective on Frankie Edgar, one of my favorite fighters of all time, and who I think is probably the best example of heart and will to win that the sport has ever seen, certainly in his time. And I think it holds up. A lot of his fights are all-time classics. The Gray Maynard trilogy, Benson Henderson fights, the Jose Aldo fights. He's had a lot of really exciting fights throughout his career. The one with Charles Oliveira comes to mind for sure. The Cub Swanson fights, Uriah Faber fight. Ton of amazing fights to look over and talk about when you're discussing the answer, Frankie Edgar. And the common theme that runs through them is that heart and will to win. And an absolute dogged approach, always moving forward, always keeping his head off the center line, boxing in combination, mixing in the wrestling very well, a very accomplished wrestler in the octagon, and number 3 in total fight time in UFC history. He made his debut in an MMA career in 2005 and was in the UFC by 2007. 15-year career at the top where he was ranked in 3 different divisions at 3 different times, had title shots in 2 different weight classes, and again, just the best personification of heart and toughness in this crazy-ass sport we all love. So without further ado, let's get into the Frankie Edgar Will to Win career retrospective. Frankie was a guy who would fight anybody in his heyday. He started his career at lightweight when there wasn't any lower weight classes, similar to Dominic Cruz, how we talked about earlier. There was no featherweight or bantamweight at the time. It was just lightweight, so that was by default where Frankie had to go. He had crisp boxing, an always present will to win, and a very, very accomplished takedown and wrestling game. Frankie would keep coming forward. He was super tenacious, and almost always the smaller guy in the cage. When he started his career at lightweight, he was a very small lightweight. As the years went on and weight cutting got more and more developed in the sport, he found himself even undersized at featherweight, and eventually finished his career at bantamweight, where even still he fought guys who were a lot bigger than him. So let's check out the storied career of the answer, Frankie Edgar, Tom Rivers' own and Jersey legend. So, for the sake of time and cohesiveness, we're going to be handpicking a few fights from Frankie Edgar's tenure that exemplify his fighting style and his legacy. Naturally, it makes sense to start with his debut against Tyson Griffin at UFC 67 way back in 2007, 15 years before his retirement. A 5-time Fight of the Night winner, Tyson Griffin was always a fan favorite every step of the way. And going into this fight, he was still young in the UFC at 22 years old, and 1-0 after taking out David Lee in under 2 minutes with a submission of the night. He was known for his heavy wrestling, heavy hands, thunderous leg kicks, and threatening submission game, and somebody who always seemed to be very well-rounded and prepared for every phase of the fight. Griffin was a tough debut fight for anybody, and he posed a lot of questions for anyone that stepped in the cage across from him until he ran into the answer. Both fighters were undefeated, so somebody's O had to go. Frankie at this point was largely unknown, making his UFC debut and being only really known for his wrestling pedigree, but he made quite the impression in this fight. Both fighters would go undefeated for several fights after this, so it was a very high-level fight for a debuting fighter in Frankie Edgar. Let's break down the components of this all-time great scrap and the first fight of the night of Frankie's illustrious 15-year UFC career, in which he would take part in another 7 Fight of the Nights. So Frankie took this fight with 1 month's notice. He was dealing with an abscess in his tooth, and he had to get a root canal only a couple of weeks out from the fight. After the root canal, he got a sinus infection that left him bedridden for a week out of his 4-week training camp. He talked to his dad, and his dad told him, "Frankie, come on, you don't gotta fight. You don't gotta do this." But he knew that Frankie wouldn't give up the opportunity that was in front of him, and Frankie, of course, would not pass it up and make it to the cage on Saturday. He goes in the cage on short notice, not the best training camp coming off of that sickness, but either way, starting in the first round, he comes out hot and pieces up Griffin with a clear speed advantage. He lands some clean combinations and is able to keep the dominant force of Griffin off of him with his sprawls and his footwork. They have some back and forth wrestling exchanges, and the pace is just remarkable. You can hear the UFC commentators talk about how this pace is crazy and how the UFC 155 division is the best division in the world because everyone's so fast and so powerful. It's a sentiment that I think really holds up over time as the lower weight classes really breed those exciting fights. As we see now today, where bantamweight and featherweight are two of the biggest marquee divisions for the sport. Lightweight was certainly a step in the right direction. Both guys got off some great offense in that first round, but Frankie clearly won on the hand speed and the wrestling advantage. And it's here where we saw the blueprint of what would eventually be an all-time great UFC talent. The speed, the pace, the boxing, and the wrestling of Edgar won him that first round on all three judges' scorecards. Second round started a little differently, with Griffin landing some huge shots on the feet, and it started to really look like Edgar was getting tired. That short notice and sinus infection and root canal and everything was starting to weigh down on him. As Griffin started to build up the striking game, he landed a huge uppercut that wobbled Frankie, and pushed Frankie to the fence and wrestled him there for a bit. Edgar stayed tough though, and after landing some huge leg kicks, he was able to change the narrative by ending the round in mount and landing some big punches. It was a very back and forth round, but I think Tyson Griffin did enough to win it. It was a tough round to score, but again, 2 out of the 3 judges gave it to Tyson. So going into the third, it was clearly 1-1, and it looked like Edgar wanted no more parts of the striking game. He was a lot more comfortable on the ground with Tyson. Going into that third, Frankie showed his legendary heart that he was known for his career, throughout his career. And this is where Frankie started to take over. Third round starts, and clearly Tyson was worse for wear. He was breathing heavy, slowing down, and his punches just didn't have that same pop that they had 5 minutes ago. Edgar also looked tired, but he kept pushing the pace and staying in Griffin's face, and ended up getting Griffin to the cage, where he was able to land some big shots and start to run away with the fight. He gets a takedown with about 2 minutes left and tries to kill some clock there, getting behind Griffin and starting to, let the clock weigh down with under a minute left. And at this point, Tyson slapped on one of the deepest knee bar attempts I've ever seen in MMA. Just the sight of the submission attempt is enough to make you cringe, as you'll see here. Griffin had Edgar's leg fully torqued, and you can see that knee completely extended. It was really hard to watch, honestly, and at that point, he even put the heel behind his arm and started to crank it that way to make it even tighter and more painful. Frankie rolled around, but couldn't get out. And instead of even trying to escape at that point, he just started punching the legs of Edgar. And to everyone's surprise, Edgar did not tap from this crazy knee bar and ends the fight with this awesome visual of him punching Tyson's leg and grimacing through the pain of the submission attempt. He sees the final bell, and all 3 judges gave him the third round for his pace and composure, and he wins his UFC debut with a unanimous decision victory. It was one of the best fights in UFC history at that point, and it still holds up as an all-time classic. Highly recommend you guys check that out. A phenomenal start to an incredible career. The heart that Edgar showed by not tapping to that deep knee bar is incredible. And that's a component that you're going to see throughout his career, is that heart that will just stay with him. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit, and the next fight we're going to take a look at is Frankie's first title shot against the legend BJ Penn. Between that debut and this first title shot, Edgar went 5-1 in the UFC, with the only loss coming from the divisional standout wrestler, an undefeated Gray Maynard. A fighter whose paths will cross with Frankie twice more before they're said and done, and what in my opinion is the best trilogy in UFC history. But before we get to that, let's talk about the amazing performance that Frankie put in Abu Dhabi against BJ Penn. Again, coming in as a huge underdog, and for the first time realizing UFC gold in his career, Frankie was counted out in this fight. BJ was unanimously the lightweight GOAT at this point. He had a great boxing game, power in his punches, very crisp striking, and an incredibly diverse ground game that saw him win 80cc gold only 2 years after starting BJJ training. And that's why they called him the Prodigy, is because he took to grappling so well at the beginning, and same with MMA. He took to MMA very well at the beginning. On paper, he should have smoked Edgar. He was 6-1 in the UFC, but he didn't seem to have any tool that was sharper than BJ's skill set. BJ was fast, he hit hard, he was tough, and he was a phenomenal grappler. The only problem was that he was fighting Frankie Edgar, a man whose mission for gold wasn't going to let anybody get in his path. He would have beat anybody in front of him that night, honestly. It didn't matter. Frankie came out more motivated than ever, stayed in BJ's face, and gave him a lot to think about for 25 minutes. It was a very close fight, and we won't break it down round by round, but many people thought that BJ had done enough to win, or at least put up enough of a fight to have at least one judge give him the decision. However, all the judges scored it differently than the fans, and the UFC brass expected it to go to Penn, but instead it went to Edgar, and even one of the judges gave him all 5 rounds. Another one gave him 4, and the last one gave him 3, so they disagreed on which rounds he won, but they all agreed that we had a new king at 155. The fans in the UFC brass, like I said, weren't as convinced. They thought that Penn did enough to win the first 3 rounds, and all those questions were answered, though, when they ran it back immediately in 6 months, and Edgar would leave no doubts this time. He won that fight on all 3 judges' scorecards again, this time 50-45 on every judge's scorecard, unanimous decision. The only round that Penn really put up an argument for was the first, and after that, Frankie just ran away with the fight. And although it took 10 rounds with a lightweight GOAT and 1 controversial decision, Frankie Edgar was now the rightful king of the lightweights and earned everyone's respect hand over fist with that performance in the rematch. Bleacher Report had put out an article that said that it was the best performance of his career. I think it's definitely one of them, but we'll talk about my favorite Edgar performance later in this pod. Besides that, Frankie had now earned everyone's respect besides the only man that had beat him at that point, Gray Maynard. Gray was huge for 155. He was a big, dominant wrestler who packed a serious punch and proved that his style would be enough to beat Frankie in their first matchup. He won that fight unanimously, wrestling the answer to a 3-round decision in which Edgar lost every round, convincingly, the only fight that he would lose every round according to the judges. With BJ in the rearview mirror and his lone loss coming to Maynard, who himself was on an 8-fight win streak, there was really only one clear contender for Frankie's second defense. The second fight between Gray and Frankie would go completely differently than the first, and it would go down as one of the greatest fights in UFC history. This is another fight that perfectly embodies Frankie's will and heart in the cage, and probably the best example of that. It was a back-and-forth war, and really a treat to watch. If you guys want to rewatch it, it's on YouTube. It's free to watch there, so I highly recommend you check that out. The first round is probably the easiest candidate for a 10-7 round in UFC history, especially at that point. Afterwards, maybe you can give one to Bader versus Parash, or, a Khabib round here or there. But at the time, it was easily a 10-8 round, at the least. And all the judges scored it that way, giving Gray 10-8 in the first round. Gray knocked Frankie around for the first 5 minutes, and on the official stats, threw over 90 punches and landed 3 knockdowns. When you're watching it, you ask yourself, how does he get through this? How does Frankie even survive? How is there still 40 minutes left in this video? And it wasn't easy for Gray to maintain that pace, of course. Throwing over 90 punches in the first round is going to wear on you. Frankie's heart was on full display, though. He gritted it out to hear that first round bell, and when the second round rolled around, you can see that Gray was really tired from throwing that many punches. In the second round, Frankie landed some clean combos, and even got Gray's head to turn on one of the straight rights. And then he gets a huge slam with about a minute left that lets everyone know I'm still here. He wins that round on all the judges' scorecards. After one of the most lopsided rounds in UFC history, it was a huge comeback round. The only other round that I can think of that rivals that type of comeback round was Bisping against Silva, when he almost got knocked out in the third and came back to win the fourth on all the judges' scorecards. The next few rounds were back and forth, with Gray winning some exchanges in round 3 and 5, but not enough in my opinion to give him both rounds. I did score the third round for Gray, and the first, again, was an easy 10-8, but I gave rounds 2, 4, and 5 to Frankie, making it a 47-47 draw. The judges were split, though, and it ended up being a split draw. So one of them had it as a draw in accordance to my scorecard, another one scored it for Frankie, and the other scored it for Gray. Either way, everyone that watched that fight knew that they just saw a piece of history in the cage. Both men left everything they had in the cage, and naturally when a title fight ends in a draw, the only reasonable recourse is a rematch. So in the third fight of the series, Frankie gets rocked bad again in the first. This time comes back to knock out Gray in the fourth round. It was an awesome moment, and it was a great way to cap off one of the best trilogies in MMA history. To come back from being beat up so bad in those first 2 rounds, and to end the trilogy with the only finish that materialized in their matchup, Frankie put a definitive stamp on that chapter in his career. The next few years were tough for the answer. He dropped split decision losses to Benson Henderson in fights that a lot of people thought he won. I definitely thought he won the second one at least. The first one was very close. And then he went down to featherweight and fought one of the GOATs in Jose Aldo. He put up a great fight in all three of these title challenges, but ultimately came up short 3 times in a row. After that 3-fight skid, Frankie rebuilt himself as the top contender at 145. He had great performances against divisional standouts in Charles Oliveira, Uriah Faber, and was able to finish established top 5 contenders in the time in Cub Swanson and Chad Mendez. This led him to a second title shot, again against the legend Jose Aldo, who had proved once again to be Edgar's kryptonite. He was a power puncher with elite takedown defense and good enough footwork and head movement to stay elusive against the tenacious Edgar, and Edgar, as great as he was, had a lot of tendencies to run forward in a straight line, which plays right into Aldo's hand, who uses pivots and knees and things like that to stay off of the center line. It seemed like everything he tried against Aldo wasn't enough. That wouldn't discourage Frankie from staying in the Shark Tank at 45, though, and he was able to put together a third title run. Let's break down my favorite fight from that stretch, and what I think is Frankie's best performance in the octagon of all time against Yair Rodriguez. At the time, Yair was, and he still is, a very dangerous fighter. At the time, he was known for his wild kicks, his unpredictable striking, and his active guard when the fight hit the mat. Frankie took this fight against a young, hungry contender and passed the test with flying colors. Frankie did a phenomenal job of staying either all the way out or all the way in, and using his footwork and angles to make Rodriguez miss the flashy kicks and ultimately set up his own takedowns. He hit a couple of really beautiful takedowns in this fight, and Yair was unable to get up from either one of them. When Frankie did get him down, he unleashed hellacious ground and pound, the likes of which I've only ever seen maybe Khabib or Cain Velasquez surpass. He stacked up on Yair's guard and just made it rain, punch after punch, elbow after elbow, and maintained the top position anytime Rodriguez tried to buck or kick himself out. It was a beautiful performance in the first round, and Edgar let Yair know that the dog is still very much alive. Second round comes out, and it's more of the same from Edgar, staying all the way out of range from Yair until he finds the opportunity for another takedown. This time, Yair slapped on a knee bar, a sort of Hail Mary attempt from at a comeback from Yair. But Frankie had been in this position before, as we discussed in that debut fight against Tyson Griffin, and he stayed tough, put pressure on the top position, and used that knee bar attempt to land some brutal elbows that forced Yair to let go of the leg. From here on out, it was more of the same. The fight evolves into what we feel like is almost a schoolyard bully beatdown from Frankie Edgar, where he just unloads huge ground and pound on Yair to the point that his eye swells up so much that the doctor is forced to call the fight between the second and third round. Everyone counted out Edgar in this fight again, and yet again he proved everyone wrong by putting on a masterful performance. In my opinion, it was his most dominant performance in the cage, maybe only lesser than the one against Cub Swanson, where he beat the shit out of Cub Swanson and finished him with like 3 seconds left in the final round. Unfortunately, the next few years were not so kind to Frankie Edgar. He was finished for the first time in his career when he took on a very dangerous Brian Ortega on short notice, and he suffered that first knockout loss. Again, he found himself to be one of the smallest guys in the division here. Even though he had went down a weight class from his original weight class, like I said, the weight cutting has gotten a lot better over the time, and now you're seeing guys who are 5'11", even bigger than guys that he was fighting at lightweight, down at featherweight. That, coupled with a final title attempt at featherweight against another divisional GOAT in Max Holloway, in which he lost, prompted a move to bantamweight for Frankie Edgar. And this was the weight class that everybody thought Edgar should have been at his whole career. There's a famous picture back in 2011 of all the champs on stage, and Dominic Cruz, who was the 135-pound champ at the time, looked bigger than Frankie at 155, even though he was 2 weight classes below him. That's a fight I really wish we could have seen happen at some point, but that's a topic for another podcast. Edgar would find success in his first foray at bantamweight, picking up a split decision win over the always tough Pedro Munoz. And it was a controversial decision at the time, but I think he stayed busy enough in that fight and did enough to win it. Unfortunately, though, this would be the last win of Edgar's career, as he would end his tenure in the UFC on a 3-fight knockout skid. Regardless of how the career ended, Frankie's run in the octagon and in the sport is one of the best of all time. He's a legend in every sense, but in my opinion is the best example of heart, toughness, and will to win the sport has ever seen. It was an honor to watch him perform anytime he stepped in there, and Edgar left a legacy that we can all relate to. No matter how much the cards are stacked against you, go out there and give it your best. Even when you've been knocked down 3 times in 5 minutes, and your nose is pouring like a faucet, or you're up against a guy that's 11 years younger than you, and 5 inches taller than you, give him hell. Frankie embodied heart and will to win throughout his career, and I think is a great example for future fighters to look at in terms of heart, determination, will to win, forward movement, and just a general very well-rounded game that works at the highest level of the sport. He's a legend, and it's been a pleasure to break down UFC career. He's a legend, and it's been a pleasure to break down the UFC career of my favorite fighter of all time, Frankie Edgar, and one that I hope you have loved seeing perform over the years. If you weren't around at the time to watch Edgar's career, or maybe you only saw the last few fights, unfortunately, I highly recommend you go back and check out some of those fights we just talked about. Primarily the Gray Maynard fights, the BJ Penn fights, the Charles Oliveira fight. There's a lot of amazing performances that you can see in Frankie Edgar's career, and I highly recommend you guys do that. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. I appreciate y'all. It's been a pleasure and an honor for me to break down this legend's career. And I hope you guys enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed going down memory lane. Thank you very much, y'all. Peace out.